I'm Tyler Hollander with Sauna Supply Company, and today I'm going to show you how to pack rocks in your new Finnleo Himalaya Rock Tower Sauna Heater. This is one of the best sauna heaters on the market. When you take the heater out of the box and you're ready to pack your rocks, you're going to find what's called the BioWater Technique Tank. Now, the BioWater Technique Tank is a great addition to your sauna stove, but you do not put it in the stove until you're done packing your rocks. Before we start rock packing, I'm going to show you the method that I use to pack rocks in the Himalaya Rock Tower Heater. The method that I use is called the Tabletop rock packing method. What you want to do is take your bigger rocks and stand them up on end in a row and come back and tabletop your flatter rocks on top of this. You'll repeat this process throughout the height of the stove. From the top-down view, when you get between the elements, what I like to do is use spacer rocks to keep the elements from closing in on each other. I'll very quickly show you what this looks like and we'll get started packing our rocks. The reason why I stack rocks between the elements is to prevent the elements from caving in on themselves. Now when you put your BioWater Technique Tank in at the very end, this will help the back two or the front two elements from caving in on themselves, but you want to be concerned with the other two elements. We'll use rocks as spacers between these throughout our rock stacking process to keep the elements apart, generating a nice even heat. With your stove, you're going to get 3 30 kg or 70-pound boxes of rocks. That should be more than enough, if done correctly, to properly fill this stove. There's a couple tips and tricks that I've learned along the way to make this work better, and I'll show you them right now. Many of the rocks in the 30 kg box of rocks, the 70-pound box, are going to be big in size like such. When you start out packing, you have to reach your hands all the way bottom of the stove. It's a little bit of a challenge. You want to use your bigger rocks first if you can. So we'll get started. It doesn't matter which side, you just have to get some on the bottom. Already from this point, if you can find a bigger, flatter rock like these two, I'll set them aside to use them as tabletops later on. Throughout your rock stacking process, you're going to find smaller rocks that look like this or even smaller. These ones do not necessarily need to be on the bottom of the stove. I like to save them for the end, but you don't have to be too picky. We're really just trying to build the base up to give us enough room to actually start strategically placing the rocks throughout the stove. At this point, I have a base of rocks covering the bottom of the stove. From the very first second the opportunity becomes available when packing your rocks in this heater, you want to try to start following the tabletop method. The tabletop method looks like such. If you can use longer rocks to gain you more height throughout the rock packing of your stove, it's going to help you later on, and it will help the performance of this stove. One tip for early stacking in the stove when you're having a tough time reaching the bottom, don't just drop your rocks in there. When you drop your rocks in there, everything will collapse and it'll pack them tighter. 3 boxes may not be enough. If you've done this incorrectly, which you will only find out at the end, you may have to pull your rocks back out and restack them again. It's better to take your time and go slow, do it right, and do it once. It'll ensure a healthy performance of this stove throughout its life. So I've almost worked my way through my first box of rocks, and I've got rocks about fist size in here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to stack it off to the side. I'm still looking for more of the bigger rocks. I know I'll be able to use these ones later as I get near the top just to dress the stove up a little bit. Let's keep stacking. This is a good example of a true tabletop stack, and that rock is kind of precariously perched in there right now. It'll get better once I find a couple of flat ones. What you're starting to see happen is that the 3 elements inside the stove have begun to push in on each other, and that's because I'm focusing most of my attention around the outside. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a spacer rock, if I can get it in there, to try to keep these two elements apart. And I'll do it on both sides and actually between both sets of elements here. Don't overbend your elements at this point. There's still time to fix it. Some of these rocks are settling. We'll get these straightened out without too much pressure on the elements themselves. It is virtually impossible to pack all of your rocks in any sauna stove without putting some pressure on the elements. Just as a rule, we want to try to keep them off of the elements as much as possible. It'll allow the stove to work more efficiently. It'll heat the rocks faster versus when they're pushed up on the elements, the big rocks will eat up all of the heat. Another suggestion I make when packing your rocks in these stoves is don't spend all of your time worried about getting every single rock you can between your middle two elements. What we're trying to do is create a chimney effect with our rocks around the outside of the stove. The heat in the stove is going to rise anyways. When we create a chimney effect, it'll allow the stove to heat the room quicker. When you throw steam, it'll cool the rocks because the room is hot. It won't have a significant drop in temperature. It'll allow it to perform more efficiently, and it's a much better sauna experience. We're on to our last box. We're about halfway up the stove. I've got a few extras which are smaller. I'm just going to use these to dress up the top of the stove when I finish. I should easily be able to pack all of these rocks and not have them end up right here. I can get all the way to the top with what I have remaining. Let's finish it off. We're at the point where we're going to add our BioWater technique tank. You can do this a lot earlier than I've done, but if you're at halfway up the stove, now is a good time to put it in. And if you forgot, you may have to take a few rocks out, which I may have to do anyways. As far as the placement of this tank goes, on an inside sauna, it's going to make no difference whether you put it on the front or on the back. What I generally recommend is put it between the two where you have enough healthy gap between the elements. If you put this on a lot earlier, it'll be harder to pack your rocks, but you'll ensure perfect placement of this from the very start. If you're on an outdoor sauna where you've got your temp sensor up on a wall right here, what I like to do is mount this on the front side of my elements, and it just sits down right on top of the elements. I'll adjust some rocks here so I can make this go perfectly. It sits down on top of the elements, and the reason why I choose the front side is so that the hottest air can escape from the back side of the stove, heat the room up quicker, get the temp sensor up to temperature so that you don't have any potential issues with the stove heating up. At this point, we have our BioWater technique tank in the stove. It just rests on top of two elements. I have about a full box of rocks left here between the two half boxes that I started with. I'm going to look for the biggest rocks that I have, and on the back side of the stove, I'm going to try to create a wall with the bigger rocks on the top half of the back side of the stove. And the reason why you do that is that you try to keep the heat off of the high limit sensor, which is the metal flange. There's a bulb inside of it on the back side of the stove. The bigger rocks here at this point are going to eat up a lot of the heat, and it'll prevent your stove from tripping out or setting the high limit early. So at this point, I have reached the top of the stove. I started with three 70-pound, 30 kg boxes of rock. I've reached the top of the stove. I've got about this much extra rock. An important point to remember at this step is that over time, with regular use and throwing water on the rocks to create the steam effect that's so desired in the sauna, these rocks will eventually start to settle. Keep your extra rocks on hand. You may have to repack them down the road. If we focus on the outsides of the stove and try to create a wall with our rocks, particularly on the back side, to prevent your high limit from tripping prematurely, it is the best possible way to get the most out of your Himalaya Rock Tower Sauna Heater. In any sauna heater, especially an electric sauna heater. Rocks are your friend, but they can also be your enemy. For this stove to work the most effectively, we want to have air gaps throughout the sides of the stove where you can poke your finger, and from the side you can actually see the elements working. We can still create a chimney effect around the outside of the stove, allowing the hottest air to get to the top. But when the rocks have proper air gaps between them, not only does it help the stove work more efficiently and effectively, but the elements do not spend the entire time trying to heat the rocks that are right next to the elements themselves. This will allow for a more even heat with all of the rocks, or the vast majority of your rocks. Proper airflow is super important. You do not want to overpack the rocks in any sauna stove, particularly the Rock Tower Himalaya heater manufactured by Finnleo, or any other Rock Tower style heater. All overpacking your rocks will do is A, not give you enough rocks to finish the proper rock stacking in your heater, and B, it will take the heater a lot longer to heat up and to heat all the rocks, because the rocks are so congested on the elements that the elements are spending all the time heating the rocks right around them, and not every single rock throughout the stove. So when you've done it effectively and properly, you should be able to go throughout the sides of the stove and poke your fingers through at various points and not always end up on a rock. Thank you, and if you have any questions, call Sauna Supply Company in Cokato, Minnesota.